Desolate lay Zion, in ruins mouldered Jerusalem. The temple was but a heap of stones. Where once stood the sanctuary now grew weeds, and jackals howled in the temple court, where once David the psalmist and his vast choir of Levites plucked the harp-strings and raised their voices in songs of praise to the Eternal. 60 years had passed since Titus the Roman sacked the temple and led the Jewish captives in triumph to Rome. There were few now alive who could remember the beauty of the temple. Yet all, young and old, still grieved over the desolation of Israel. But for their sorrow they could find no consolation. Their Roman masters oppressed them sorely, afflicted their lives with humiliations without number. Worst of all was Tinius Rufus, the Roman governor of Judea. He mocked at their suffering with the frank cruelty of the conqueror. Thereupon, the Jews raised an outcry to heaven. For how long, O Lord, will the Roman legions stamp on the neck of Judah? For how long, O Lord, will the Roman eagle dig its sharp claws into our flesh? Yet they did not abandon hope. Still too weak to strike back, they brooded in silence and secretly prayed for the day of vengeance. But there was one who could not wait, who could not rest, who could not resign himself to silence. That was Rabbi Akiba, the crown of the Torah, he who expounded the law to hushed multitudes. Aged as he was, he went on a hazardous long journey into all the far lands of the dispersion, wherever Jews lived, in search of one worthy enough to lead a holy rebellion against Roman tyranny. And he exhorted his brethren in Babylon, in Egypt, in Arabia, and other lands, "Return to the land of your forefathers. The rising against the enemy of our people is not far off." One day there came to Rabbi Akiba a man of radiant beauty and great strength. "My name is Simeon Bar Kosiba," he said. "I have heard the cries of my people, and have come to lead them out of the Roman bondage. Give me your blessing, O Akiba." And Akiba saw that this man's spirit was like flame, and that his words were like sparks falling on kindling wood. He marveled greatly, and his heart was filled with gladness. He then spoke the words of Scripture, "There shall come a star out of Jacob, and a scepter shall rise out of Israel, and shall smite the corners of Moab, and destroy all the children of Sheth." Thereupon Akiba renamed him Bar Kochba, in order that in this wise he might fulfill the scriptural passage concerning the coming of the Messiah. Then, turning to the multitude, Akiba cried out with rapture, "Behold, King Messiah!" There were 24,000 disciples who were ready to follow Akiba in life, and when they heard Bar Kochba's voice, they were prepared to follow him even in death, for the sake of Zion and Israel. So they cried with one voice, "Surely this is King Messiah, who has come to break our bonds and lift the yoke of tyranny from us. Lead us, Bar Kochba." "The time has not come yet," he replied, and he told them to prepare secretly for the uprising. "Beat your plowshares into swords, and not your swords into plowshares, as the prophet bade you. Hide them and wait." Now the Emperor Hadrian in Rome sent word to Tinius Rufus in Judea, "Turn Jerusalem into a great Roman city, and it shall be the capital of all my provinces in the east. Let it be called Aelia Capitolina, and where the temple of the Jews formerly stood, let there be raised a temple to the glory of our God, Jupiter Capitolinus." Tinius Rufus did as his master bade him, and he began to build a Roman city and a temple to the Roman god. When Bar Kochba beheld these abominations, he was filled with wrath. "The time has come," he cried. Thereupon, thousands upon thousands of Jewish youths, foremost among them the disciples of Akiba, dug up the arms they had hidden. They gathered around Bar Kochba and swore a solemn oath with him that they would not rest until the enemy had been driven from the land of Israel. Thereafter, by ship and by caravan, across treacherous deserts and stormy seas, From every land of exile in which Jews suffered and dreamed of the redemption of their people, came great multitudes of Jews to join Bar Kochba's army. Also, thousands of heathen flocked to him from neighboring countries, even from distant Parthia. They said, "If the Jews regain their liberty, we too will be free, for then the tyranny of Rome will have been broken." When Bar Kochba had gathered the great multitude of his soldiers, he said to them, "Know, O my brothers, that the enemy is mighty. They are well armed and well trained. We have poor arms and are not trained for war. Our valor is our greatest weapon. Therefore I have chosen to test each man of you. Who will come forward and cut off one of his fingers as proof that he is unafraid?" Thereupon 200,000 of his men came forward and cut off each his own finger, thus proving their firmness of spirit. When the sages heard of this, they were dismayed. "Why do you wish to make cripples out of this great multitude?" they rebuked him. "Do you know a better way to test their courage?" asked Bar Kochba. So the rabbis counseled him, "Let every one of your soldiers, while riding on horseback, show his strength by tearing up a cedar with his hands." Bar Kochba readily agreed to their counsel, and thus he proved 200,000 more soldiers without any injury to them. This took place in the 61st year after the destruction of Jerusalem by Titus. And Bar Kochba began to harass the enemy on every side. He attacked the Roman garrisons when they least expected it, and destroyed them. And before any Roman force could be sent against them, he and his men escaped into the hills and hid in the caves. Finally, Bar Kochba met in open battle the Roman legion led by Tinius Rufus. So wise was Bar Kochba as a leader, so fierce the hatred of his men for the Romans, so ardent their love of Zion and their people, that they flung themselves upon their enemies and won the victory. When the Emperor Hadrian in Rome first heard of the revolt in Judea, he laughed. "What fools! Do they expect to overthrow the power of Rome?" But when he heard of the many victories of the Jews, he became alarmed. What if the Jews succeed in their revolt? He said to himself. That will put heart into all rebellious people in my provinces. And so Hadrian commanded Publius Marcellus, the proconsul of Syria, to march at once with his legions to the aid of Tinius Rufus. But he too was defeated in battle by Bar Kochba, who, in 1 year's time, captured from the Romans 50 strongholds and 985 towns and villages. Thoroughly frightened, the Emperor Hadrian called for his greatest general, Julius Severus. "Take 4 mighty legions and bring me back Bar Kochba alive and tied to your chariot wheel." And Severus marched against the rebels in the land of Israel. Now Severus was a cunning general. He said to himself, "Where those Roman generals who came before me failed, I will succeed. They were impatient. I will be patient. They fought open battles. I will triumph by starving the Jews." Severus then slowly and cunningly laid his plans. He cut off, one by one, the sources of Bar Kochba's supplies. The heavens too seemed to be against the Jews, for a severe drought settled on the land. Thus the crops were burnt, and Bar Kochba's soldiers had little food. One by one, the Romans choked up the wells of the Jews. They turned aside the rivers and streams, so that the Jews had to suffer the torments of thirst as well as of hunger. Also, one by one, the patient Severus gained back each stronghold held by Bar Kochba. Now it happened that Bar Kochba had retreated with all the remnants of his army into the fortified city of Bethar. There the Romans laid siege for 1 whole year. No food could reach the defenders. When Bar Kochba saw his soldiers dying of hunger and thirst, and the enemy drawing ever closer to the walls of the city, he cried out in sorrow, "O Lord, since you do not help us, at least do not help our enemies." The Romans finally broke through the gates and poured through a breach in the walls into the city. Bar Kochba knew that the end had come, whereupon he called to his men in a mighty voice, "Better death as free men than life as slaves under the Romans." With these words he flung himself into battle. None could withstand him, and he slew many of the enemy. And all the Jews followed his example, and fought until they could fight no more, and were slain. Now Julius Severus remembered Hadrian's words, how he had commanded him to return to Rome in triumph with Bar Kochba tied to his chariot wheel. So he offered a large reward for his capture. A greedy Samaritan had chanced upon the body of Bar Kochba as it lay in death upon the wall, bleeding from 100 wounds. He cut off the head, and, eager for the reward, hastened with it to the Roman general. When Severus saw Bar Kochba's head, he cried out in rage to the Samaritan, "Fool! I wanted Bar Kochba alive, not his head!" And Severus could no longer take any pleasure in his victory. Thank you for listening. Please don't forget to like and subscribe.